Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to provide these two bins of African nightcrawler worms with this fairly generous feeding. I mean, it doesn't appear to be much, but it must have a fairly high moisture content because even though visually it seems a little bit deceiving in terms of how much there is here, I could really feel from its weight that there's a good bit of stuff there, you know. If it all just ends up being moisture, which ends up, you know, coming out of the material as the stuff thaws out because it's fresh out of my freezer, then I suppose perhaps there's not all that much food substance there. Perhaps it is mostly moisture. But when there's a good bit of weight to it, somehow you get this feeling like the worms are being fed a pretty generous helping. So the place where we fed last time is marked with these two coffee filters. We fed right down the middle. And I guess we classified that last feeding as one that was relatively generous because we felt like during the previous check-in there had been a somewhat skimpy amount of food provided to these little guys. And we did something a little different here. I mean, in the past you might have seen me using leafy matter sprinkled out across the top of these surfaces, and I refer to that as sort of a top dressing. And over the past few check-ins in this system, we've been just trying to do that same top dressing approach using my prepared bedding, or maybe not even my prepared bedding, but just some stuff that's straight out of my shredder, this mix of shredded cardboard and paper. And I was going to do the same thing today. I was just going to drop in more, as we did here last time, spreading this stuff out across the top surface. It's picked up some moisture from being in the bin and from having been covered with plastic, and it's also covered, well, not covered, but there's good amount of worm casting material all over the stuff too, indicating to me that there's some worm traffic happening out on the surface. And I guess my idea was that since we're going to be coming back in here with another helping of this stuff to top coat the material, we'll just blend this stuff in as we go. So let's proceed over here in bin number 1 to see how that last feeding they got 14 days ago. 14 days later, my guess is that the majority of what they got is probably gone, because I think there were things like celery and potato peels and carrot and then again a whole bunch of stuff that had been frozen before being put into the worm bins, and it led me to believe that we would find very little leftovers. But here's an example of a pretty good chunk of leftover material, some carrot, and this to me looks like even more carrot. And it seems so odd because as we went through this feeding zone, we didn't really see anything other than maybe leftover bedding, and then out of nowhere comes the end of a carrot. I don't know what it is about that carrot. I wonder why it didn't get the attention all the other food got that was put in here 2 weeks ago. A little bit unusual. Things like that kind of make me say, I'm also starting to bump into some other objects here. I can feel them, even though it's a little bit difficult to see them. I can feel them. They're little chunks of corn cob, and kind of a new approach that I've been adopting in most of my systems where I'm composting corn cob. Not everywhere, but in most cases I've just been getting in the habit of spending just a minute or two to break this stuff up into little chunks so that it can finally go. It does seem to me like some of the corn cob bits that I encountered here were spherical in shape, and those would have been those little corn cob spheres that I had laying around here in my wormery for so long. I believe it was in this system that we finally decided to grab these corn cob spheres and chuck them in a worm bin, and we might have broken the majority of them up by now. But I figured that one seemed to be pretty much intact and still clearly spherical in shape, so I figured why not just let that one stay. Any other bits of corn cob that are just, generic chunks of corn cob, I'll generally just try to bust those up as we go. So let's do a similar inspection of the feeding zone here in bin number 2. I would assume here that we're going to find much the same. So I'm not kind of going about it in as much of an exploratory nature as what we did over in bin number 1. Bin number 1 or bin number 1 of multiple bins, in this case only 2. Sometimes we've got 3 or 4 separate systems going side by side, which all get checked in on at the same time. So usually after I've taken care of business in the first of multiple bins, I'll feel like I've already got a handle on what to expect in the other ones. And it looks like we've got a great many more pieces of leftover corn cob over here in bin number 2, for whatever reason. Perhaps we just didn't find as many of them last time, leading me to breaking them up. So now that they're here, we might as well give them the treatment that's going to really, in the end, help them break down more quickly by being fragmented into small pieces. And these all appear to me like, maybe not this one, this just seems like a piece of corn cob that ended up in a feeding, but these to me almost all seem like this one too. I'll just break it up because I don't think it's one of the ones that we set aside once upon a time as corn cob spheres. So here I found 3, over there I found 1. I guess the absence of a big chunk of carrot is made up by more corn cob over here in bin number 2. So I think we're at the point where we can finally give them some food instead of being so inquisitive and poking around everywhere looking at stuff. I believe when we get around to covering up these feeding zones, I'm going to be attempting to really agitate the material that surrounds the feeding areas to mix in all that top covering shredded paper cardboard that we encountered in the beginning, so that the stuff is all mixed in thoroughly throughout the whole system. And I think in the end it's going to just make for a much more cozy space for these African night crawlers. Yeah, African night crawlers definitely like their bedding, not only as a place to hang out and live, but they do turn to their bedding as a food source, perhaps even a little bit more than many other worm types do. So we're going to give each system a banana peel. And now a large portion of what's in here is just some peppers that I believe might have been placed into the refrigerator in a place where they got frozen, and peppers after they've been frozen are not one of the types of foods that you can really enjoy and eat afterwards, because it just pretty much destroys the texture of this stuff. And this must have been a portion of the bag that this stuff was in my freezer, where a lot of the moisture just settled and froze into a big hunk, because I'm having no luck breaking that stuff apart. So we'll just leave it be. It'll thaw out and become available to the wormies as food soon. So I think we've divvied up their feeding today pretty fairly and equally. So before we get into covering up this feeding zone, I'm dropping in a little bit of my grit, pulverized eggshell in this case, and I've got worm chow here too. Perhaps we'll just spice up the feeding with a little bit of this bite-sized stuff. Kind of give the wormies some instant gratification on the food that they're eating. And now we'll cover up the feeding zone, but in a way that we, at the same time, try to work all this loose bedding material that was out on the surface down into the bed. Really nice stuff. It's now seasoned for 2 weeks from having been in the worm bin, and it's damp. So it's stuff that should really be welcomed by the worms when they encounter it. Alright, so I just bumped into some large, more corn cob. It was just really covered with a whole bunch of castings material. And it was pretty big, so it definitely had to be busted up. And here and there, I'm encountering handfuls of material that once again include a corncob. This one might have been actually corncob sphere, just based on its very spherical feeling when I held it in my hand, but I broke it anyway. Perhaps bin number 1 will have no more corncob spheres sooner than bin number 2, because bin number 2 seems to be holding on to its corncob spheres a little bit better. But they are really breaking down and probably at the point where they're not going to make it much longer in terms of holding together. So that looks really nice. It felt good to blend in all that bedding material into the system. So it does seem to me like in the past a lot of my systems have just been very deficient in bedding. And I would always be kind of reluctant to blend in more bedding type materials. Here's another corncob sphere. Into a bunch of material that already looked to me like almost harvestable finished castings. But I think that in itself could be the type of behavior that eventually leads to the material getting all clumped together and getting very unmanageable. So I'm trying to see if I can modify my worm farming techniques here. Another corncob sphere. Man, bin number 2 is chock full of corncob spheres. So yeah, I'm trying to see what I can do about coming up with methods that result in much finer, freer flowing material rather than stuff that has a tendency to clump up. And when I look at other worm channels where they're always really consistently producing material that never clumps up and always flows neatly, I think one of the main differences between my methods and theirs is the fact that they're much more generous with the bedding than I am. So it does feel like, following suit from that perspective could provide me with improved results. So we'll see how that goes. And I definitely like the way this top coating of bedding has been working. I mean, it's worked well for me in the past when I did it with leafy matter. But using this stuff too seems to work quite nicely. The worms do definitely adopt it as stuff that they're comfortable moving in and out of. Evidence of that was just the few worms I noticed right on the plastic cover, meaning they came through this stuff to get up onto the plastic cover in pursuit of the droplets of moisture on it. And then I definitely saw lots of castings all over this stuff too when we first got in here, which we observed together. So I think we're almost ready, but let's not forget we're using these old feeding zone indicators that were in here from last time. They're holding up well enough to be utilized one more time to indicate to ourselves where in the bin we fed, right down the middle here. And this way, next time we come back in here, we'll have no trouble locating the feeding zones. As if we would have a lot of trouble doing that. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in with the African night crawlers. Doing really nice in here on day 94, receiving feeding number 8 after a 14-day interval since the last check-in. And I guess we're not going to come back in here in the next 6 days, so between now and then they're going to reach their 100th day in service, so a quick preemptive happy 100 days celebrated on day 94. All right, everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before I go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.